Yay! Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wednesday, and welcome to our inaugural State of Homelessness address in the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Athenaeum Theater. We're so happy to be hosted here. We're so happy to have you all here. We're just really excited to have this conversation. There's been a lot of thought and intention that has gone into today's State of Homelessness address as we unveil the 2024 point in time count and really orient that data into a larger picture of what's happening here in Indianapolis. So with that, I want you to know that while, again, we try to be as thoughtful and intentional about this address, we are always open to feedback. So as you leave here today, if you have ideas about how we make this even better and more exciting for next year, please don't hesitate to share those with us. Before we get started, I want to have a few housekeeping notes. If you need a little caffeine, Coat Check Coffee is open until 4. You're welcome to run and grab some caffeine. And restrooms are downstairs right next to the Coat Check coffee counter. So if you need restrooms, they are down on the first floor. Okay, so I am honored to kick us off today. My name is Chelsea Herring-Posey. I'm the Executive Director with the Coalition for Homelessness Intervention and Prevention, or as many of you know it, CHIP. A little bit about CHIP, our mission and our vision, and why we're here today. So part of our vision for Indianapolis is that we envision a city where everyone has a safe, stable, and affordable home and is embraced by compassionate care and an inclusive community. That's what we want for every single resident of this city. And in order to achieve that vision, CHIP is committed to partnering with the Indianapolis community to advance a shared vision to end homelessness by inspiring collective action and advocating for permanent housing solutions. And so many of you in this room are part of that collective. What we're really hoping to do today to help elevate this work is to shift and inform the narrative around homelessness, and often the misleading narrative around homelessness, that it is the product of individual failures and individual decisions, and we're going to challenge that today. We want to cultivate a better understanding of the root causes and the drivers of homelessness, because by understanding the root causes and drivers, we can then better understand what the actual solutions are. We want to align this narrative around a core belief that housing should be a human right, that everyone deserves housing. And to really advance this narrative, we've got to use data. We've got to look at data, we've got to understand what the data tells us, and really use that data to drive greater impact. And so part of today is also how do we look at data in the larger context? What does it tell us? And how do we create a data culture that helps us improve our practices, our performance as a community, and to really drive equity? I want to do a little framing for today, and maybe a challenge to all of you in the audience. And this is a quote by Stacey Abrams. I think it really captures what many of us are here to do. We are strongest when we see the most vulnerable in our society, when we bear witness to their struggles, and then we work, and I'll add the word collectively, to create better systems to make things better. We've got to create systemic responses to the challenge and issue of homelessness. So as you listen in today and think about your work, your positioning in the community, I challenge you to reflect on how your work contributes to creating a more equitable and effective system of care for those in our community who are experiencing homelessness, or contributes to perpetuating systems that are inequitable, that create disparities, and perpetuate vulnerability. Because our work is not done in isolation. It's part of a much larger ecosystem that everyone in this room is part of in some way or another. And that ecosystem either has the power to come together and dismantle barriers and challenge and dismantle inequity, or to hold it up. So as you listen in today, I want you to hold this belief. Housing should be a human right, and we hold that dear to everything we're going to talk about. And as we talk about data today, know that every number presented reflects a real, sacred human life. There is a person behind the data. So our journey today is going to look a little like this. We're going to frame our unifying community equity goal so that as we listen and hear the data, we know that that's the thing that we're coming together to really make a greater impact on. We're going to unveil the 2024 point-in-time count data. We're going to talk a little bit about why is that data not surprising? Well, if we understand the key drivers, this is predictable. So we'll talk about some of those drivers. We'll look at what the homeless response system is doing to address the issues that we're facing and what the solutions are that we need to continue to rally around. And we'll leave here today with a call to action for all of us to continue doing this work. So before we go on this journey, I want to excitedly introduce Mayor Joe Hogsett to say a few words about the point-in-time count, the city, the efforts that we're all doing here in Indianapolis to make greater impact. So, Mayor Hogsett.
Well, indeed, good afternoon. I'm honored to be with all of you today. I'm somewhat nervous about moving anything because I don't want my own actions to slow us down at all. Thank you, Chelsea, for the kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. Obviously, thanks to the Coalition for Homelessness Intervention and Prevention for inviting me to speak to you briefly so that I can give you a perspective as to what the city is currently doing. And then we can get into the data and the interpretation of what our path forward needs to be. I have seen, I won't reveal it, but I have seen the point-in-time count data that will be unveiled to all of us shortly. And I am encouraged by the strides that we have made as a community. But more than that, we need to be driven to make an even bigger impact than we already are, and in the future. Because ultimately our work does not end until Indianapolis becomes a place where homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. In 2016, yes, I've been in office a while, but when I first took office in 2016, I learned about an approach called Housing First. Most everyone in this audience understands its concept. It's an approach with a goal to quickly and successfully connect individuals and families experiencing a housing crisis to permanent housing without preconditions to barriers or other barriers to entry. No preconditions, no other barriers to entry. Supportive services are offered to maximize housing stability and to hopefully prevent returns to homelessness. I learned how this Housing First approach was working in other cities and seen as a way forward, a best practice, if you will, to address homelessness. Since that time, the city has invested millions of dollars in this approach, by strategically deploying a diverse range of funding sources that target different household incomes and types, with a specific focus to address historic racial inequities that exist in housing. Our efforts, executed alongside dozens of housing and social service partners at the local, at the state, and at the federal levels, leverage a combination of funding mechanisms, including federal funds from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, local funding streams, and tax incentives, such as tax increment financing, tax abatement, and payment in lieu of taxes. Additionally, the city recognizes that we must build more market rate housing to complement subsidized or naturally occurring affordable housing. Doing so contributes to a more balanced housing ecosystem, which in turn mitigates overall costs. In other words, we need more housing of all kinds to ensure access to housing at every income level. Some examples of these investments that we're making include Hannah Commons and Compass on Washington developments, which taken together provided our city with nearly 100 additional permanent supportive housing units. The city has also completely changed our policies and tools with an eye toward more affordable housing. Since 2016, the city has incentivized nearly 6,000 units of housing, leveraging HUD funding, economic incentives, and other funding sources like ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act monies, and in fact, we've used some opioid settlement funds. This unit count represents a mixture of ownership, rental, and supportive housing units. It also includes a realignment of our policies to be responsive to racial disparities in housing. But in addition to our efforts to increase the availability of affordable housing in our city, we are also working toward ensuring that our residents on the verge of homelessness are able to remain housed. We have invested millions of dollars in various support services and different kinds of housing assistance. For instance, we have been engaged in eviction prevention work with the Tenant Advocate Project, or TAP, for several years. From 2021 through 2023, don't need to tell anyone in this audience, some of the most challenging years in our city's history, and frankly the country and the world's history. But for the city of Indianapolis, from 2021 to 2023, TAP has provided legal assistance to 6,796 households facing eviction. And the city, from September of 2021 through to the end of 2024, will have committed more than $3 million to this program alone. I'm proud of these accomplishments. And I'm proud of our community for coming together to leverage the city's investments. I'm also proud of the intentional work being done by the city and our partners in the Continuum of Care and Blueprint Council to close the disproportionate gap for Black individuals and families experiencing homelessness. But what the data tells me is that we must do more. So that's exactly what we are doing. More. This year we opened the St. George Bridge Housing Program. This new asset offers 53 units of bridge or transitional housing for unsheltered individuals who are waiting to be placed in their permanent supportive housing units. We are already seeing promising outcomes. Just in a few short months since this program launched, not only do the individuals and families at St. George have a safe place to lay their head each night, they are also receiving support to help them succeed and thrive in other aspects of their lives. Providing support services as people transition to permanent housing is a key part of our Housing First approach. The Department of Metropolitan Development also issued a request for information for our master leasing program earlier this year. The next step is to work with respondents as we develop and pilot the program, bringing master leasing to life in Indianapolis with a goal of 200 units in the coming years. We have seen other cities implement this tool with a great deal of success in addressing homelessness. So it wasn't my idea, but we decided to steal it. And that's exactly what we're doing. We intend to have the same result that perhaps Milwaukee or other cities have experienced: success. And in response to several studies, most notably the report from the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority's Low Barrier Homeless Shelter Task Force, the city has committed $12 million toward the construction of our city's first low barrier emergency shelter. It will feature 150 emergency beds that will serve singles, couples, and families experiencing homelessness. But I want to emphasize that we are not simply building a shelter. We are building a hub that prioritizes supportive services and housing navigation. And it will be 24/7 in its operation. We're implementing historically successful practices in order to provide more than just short-term assistance to those staying at an overnight shelter. And based on our current estimate, this project will be operational in the winter of 2026. But is that enough? I don't think so. I believe that we cannot rest on the laurels of our past accomplishments or wait and see if these new investments make an impact. We must continue our commitment to housing first and keep things moving full steam ahead if we want to meaningfully address this pervasive problem in our time. We also have a responsibility to our unhoused neighbors to ensure that resources such as affordable housing, such as health care, such as supportive services are accessible to all individuals in all communities throughout the city of Indianapolis. And again, I want to emphasize this means we must eliminate racial disparities within the system as well. Because the people who we see on our sidewalks, at our interstate off-ramps, at our bus stops, and in our parks, not to mention the many individuals and families who we do not see. They are all people who deserve a home. They deserve a roof over their heads and a warm bed to sleep in at night, at the very least. We must remember that they are first and foremost our neighbors who have experienced untold hardship and who have shown resilience in the face of it. They are indeed worthy of our time, our commitment, and our investment. And that's why I've been committed to doing everything that the city is capable of doing to help them over these past 8 years. And that is why I'm committed more than ever before to helping them today and in the days to come. I'm confident, as Chelsea referenced, I'm confident that our community will be better when we do better by our most vulnerable residents, our neighbors. In my faith tradition, I am called to love neighbor as I do myself. And in those scriptures that I'm familiar with, we don't get to decide who neighbor is. Neighbor has been chosen for us. Neighbor is every person. Neighbor is other. Neighbor is stranger. Neighbor is different. Neighbor is outcast. Neighbor is, at least in one place, inclusive of enemy. And I am radically commanded to love neighbor, all neighbors. As I shared earlier, I am encouraged by the strides we have made. But more importantly, I stand before you ready to continue this work and further expand our efforts so that one day soon, housing in Indianapolis is truly attainable for every need. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mayor Hogsett, for joining us today, for sharing the city's commitment to this continued effort, and we look forward to continuing to work collaboratively with you and everyone in this room to make a bigger impact. Thank you so much. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what unifies us as a city. And Mayor Hogsett did a phenomenal job of really touching on this, that we have to have a shared vision that we all buy into and that we put our hand up to say, I'm in. I'm ready to do what I can to help advance this vision. And under the leadership of the Blueprint Council and the Continuum of Care, a vision was cast 7 years ago almost, that we believe everyone has the right to be housed and connected to care. And that is essentially the premise of housing first, right? We solve someone's housing crisis, we focus on housing, and we make sure there is quality care to walk alongside somebody. And that is what we want for everybody in this community who needs that. But year over year, as we looked at the data and we looked at who disproportionately is being impacted by homelessness and not having access or benefiting from this vision, what we saw again and continue to see year over year is that Black individuals and Black families are disproportionately experiencing and impacted by homelessness. And after years of reporting this in the PIT data, the Blueprint Council finally said, enough is enough. We're tired of talking about this disparity. Let's do something about it. Let's make this our unifying goal so that we can really focus our efforts. And so a year ago to this week, a public goal was launched by the leadership of the Blueprint Council to reduce Black homelessness by 35% by 2025, which would effectively eliminate racial disparities in homelessness. This is a huge goal, it's a unifying goal, and it is time that we do better. Because you will hear some things today that share, while we're making progress in some areas, we've still got a lot of work to do, particularly around racial equity. Who has access to housing, who has support in staying housed. This is significant work, but this is our work. So without further ado, I would like to have Abe Roll come up to the stage. Abe is one of CHIP's HMIS data narrators, and he is going to walk us through this year's point in time count and really dig into what is the PIT, what does it tell us, what can we learn from this. So Abe, I'll hand it over to you.
Can everybody hear me okay? All right, so thank you all again for coming and listening about our point in time count this year. The community this year put a ton of work into making this point in time count truly one of the best that we have ever had. So we so appreciate you all coming out, facing the rain and all the weather, to hear about the point in time count, to hear about our neighbors experiencing homelessness, and how we can use the point in time count to better improve their lives moving forward. So what I want to share with you all today, I'm going to start by a brief overview of what the point in time count is, how we conduct it, and what data is available. We're then going to look at different subpopulations and see where the racial breakdown is as it relates to a racial inequity goal. And then we're going to talk about what the point in time count can look like in 2025 and moving forward, and then take that data and that vision and put it in the context of other community data. Because as Chelsea mentioned, nothing that we're going to show you is surprising when we look at the inequities and disparities across all of our different systems. So to start, very basically, the point in time or the PIT count is a required census for communities across the nation. Every year in the last 10 days of January, communities need to do a census of a single night of who is experiencing homelessness in their location. All of the different communities' PIT data gets put together and actually gets submitted to Congress via the annual housing assessment report. And that helps Congress inform their federal policy and all of their federal funding decisions as it relates to homelessness. And what these single night snapshots show us are essentially who is experiencing homelessness and where. We also get information on the barriers that they might be facing towards getting housed. And then we take that point in time data, we compare it with our housing inventory count, and we see what resources are being utilized and by who. And because it's an annual count, we're able to look at the trends over time to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in the community and where targeted interventions need to happen. So before we get into the specifics of how we get the data, I want to start by saying that nationally, PIT data is showing that the United States is seeing drastic increases in the number of people who are experiencing homelessness. The last 5 or 6 years, that number has gone up by at least 15% and really started skyrocketing around 2023. So keep that in mind as we're kind of going through the numbers in Indianapolis. Nationally, everyone is seeing increases in homelessness. But to get the data to kind of talk about what we're seeing today, I want to start by saying the point in time when we say a snapshot of people experiencing homelessness, it's a very specific group. So it's folks who are staying in emergency shelters, folks who are staying in transitional housing programs, or folks who are unsheltered. When we say unsheltered, those are folks who are essentially living in place and sleeping in a place not meant for human habitation. They might be sleeping in their car, in a tent in a camp, in an abandoned building. That's who the populations we're talking about for the PIT. And depending on these populations, we get the data a couple different ways. So for those in emergency shelters and transitional housing, those programs submit their data electronically. They send us the data for who on this one night was in their program, the demographic breakdowns, the household size, and we take that information, we clean it, and we make sure it's good to go for our submission. For the unsheltered count, it's a two-step process. So on the actual night of the PIT, outreach workers will go out and they will go to a number of locations where they know the unsheltered neighbors tend to stay, and they do a brief survey. And in that survey, they explicitly ask, where will you be sleeping tonight? The second piece is that the next 4 or 5 days after the PIT, we have volunteers go to different service sites, such as community centers, food pantries, places where those experiencing homelessness might be getting services, and they do that same survey, but they say, where were you sleeping on this night being the PIT count. So then we take all that data, it gets put together and cleaned, and then we submit it in one batch to HUD. Now, I do want to do a quick note that as with any survey, in general, consider the survey results fairly conservative, because we know that, first of all, the surveys are voluntary. No one is required to take the survey. It does not impact your receipt of services if you don't take it. But also, unsheltered neighbors, they're transient. They're not necessarily going to be in the same spot on this one night. And one example of that was just the weather this year. You know, it was really cold, it was really rainy, and we heard from folks that they tend to sleep outside, they just happen to not be on that night. So do take that in consideration. But with that being said, 2024 was by far our most comprehensive unsheltered point in time count to date. Outreach staff did a phenomenal job and had cataloged over 300 locations to go and survey folks. And so on the night of the PIT, which was January 24th, right at dusk, about 13 or so teams went out and they did surveys throughout Marion County. And that's a really important thing I want you to keep in mind. It was not a downtown Indianapolis problem or a downtown count. They went to all 9 of our townships and they found people across the county. It is a county-wide problem. So we took this unsheltered data, we put it with our shelter data, and what we saw was, on the night of January 24th, 2024, 1,701 individuals were experiencing homelessness here in Indianapolis. And I do want to do a quick plug that there is a lot of data that we have with the point in time count. So our focus today is going to be on disparities and our equity goal, but if you are interested in seeing it broken down by location, by gender, this is all going to be available on our website. This is actually a snapshot of the dashboard that will be available after today's event. But again, 1,701 individuals were counted on January 24th, and unfortunately that was an increase from 2023. In 2023, we saw 1,619 folks, so we did see an overall increase of about 5%. And what you can see on the blue line here is that that increase was really driven by an increase in folks who are staying in our emergency shelters. And in particular, it was folks who are staying in our winter contingency beds, which are seasonal beds that are available in the cold months to help people get out of the elements. That is essentially where that increase was coming from. The yellow and the green lines here at the bottom, that shows that we did see a slight decrease in our unsheltered count and in the folks who are staying in transitional housing. I do want to be really clear though that while we are always hoping to see a decrease in the unsheltered count, these are still historically high numbers. That 339 is way too many individuals to be sleeping outdoors, especially when it is cold and rainy as it was in this year's pit. 339 is much higher than we saw in 2020, and 2020 was a number higher than we saw in years past. So we are happy to see a decrease, but it is still much too high. Now on this slide, and there is a lot going on this slide, but what we're seeing is how does Indianapolis compare to cities that are similar to us? And so when we look at similar cities, so Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, we're seeing a lot of the same things. In particular, Columbus, Ohio, and Louisville, Kentucky, they are also seeing these increases. This is not isolated to Indianapolis, but it is national, and cities just like us are seeing the same thing. And when we look at our PIT data, we always look at select subpopulations, and we look at it over time to see what is happening and changing within those. So two populations that we always look at, we look at families experiencing homelessness, and by that I mean families with young children under 18, and those who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And by that, we're talking about folks who have at least one disabling condition, such as a physical disability, and have been experiencing homelessness for a substantial time. We will look at both of those populations, folks with families with children and those who are chronically homeless. Those numbers the last few years have been going up and are staying high. There was a slight decrease this year, but it is essentially being maintained at high levels. We did, however, see one positive area, and that's what you can see on the yellow line here, and that's that the number of veterans experiencing homelessness during the point in time count is slowly starting to go down. So there is some positive news there. We are seeing less veterans on our point in time counts. And now, when we talk about the overrepresentation and the disparity in this population, what we're meaning by that is that the population experiencing homelessness does not look like the population of Marion County overall. So the recent census estimates show that just under 30% of Marion County is Black, but over 50% consistently of the folks experiencing homelessness are Black. And so that's what we mean when we're saying we're seeing these disparities and Black individuals are overrepresented. And as Chelsea mentioned, this is a disparity that we have known about and seen for quite a while. And so in 2023, when the equity goal was established, about 52% of the point in time count that year were individuals who were Black. And so the hope was we will start doing very targeted work, and that 52 is going to slowly come down until the equity is eliminated. Unfortunately, what we saw this year is that there was actually an increase in Black homelessness. 53% of the individuals this year that we counted were Black. So we saw that, and we immediately dove in. We wanted to see where are these inequities happening the most, and where are the disparities happening the most consistently. And what we quickly found was that the disparities happen regardless of the subpopulations that we're looking at. Across the board, we are seeing Black individuals and Black families showing up more than they should. But what was most informative and what we're using to really inform the PIT moving forward is, again, where is those disparities happening the most, and where are they the most severe? And so these are the ones we'll walk through today. So to start, when we look at the unsheltered population, historically the unsheltered population tends to be white neighbors. What we saw this year was that since 2022, we have been seeing a slight increase in the number of folks who are unsheltered who are also Black. And so for 2024, the number of Black individuals was about 34%. So it is a new disparity, and it's one that we need to continue to look at to make sure that number goes back down and does not keep increasing. We also looked at our veteran population, and as I said earlier, our veteran population is going down overall, but what we noticed is that despite seeing an overall decrease, we have, in the last 2 or 3 pits, seen an increase in the number of Black veterans experiencing homelessness. And so in the 2024 pit, right at 50% of the veterans we counted were Black. So again, we want to make sure that we will take this data and we say that we're going to continue that decrease for veterans, but make sure it's happening equitably across the board. We also always look specifically at the youth who are experiencing homelessness here in Marion County. And one group that we look at are youth who are unaccompanied. So we look at youth who are under 18 and young adults who are 18 to 24 and are experiencing homelessness on their own. They're not with other family, their household is themselves. And when we look at these young folks, what we see is there was a slight decrease here in 2024, but overall and through time, we're seeing that number is trending higher. More youth and young adults are showing up in the system, and every year the majority of them are Black youth and young adults. And when we think about youth homelessness in particular, I do want to note that we also look at youth who are both experiencing literal homelessness and those who are housing unstable. So in our surveys, we also talk to youth who might be doubled up, they might be in overcrowded areas, going from couch to couch. Even though those youth aren't included in the official PIT count submission, it is a very important part of the youth narrative, and so we do capture that as well. And I want to be very open about the fact that these numbers, both unaccompanied young adults and housing unstable youth, these are severe undercounts. The youth are a very transient population. They might be on a couch one day and a shelter the next day, outside the next day. So a single night snapshot isn't necessarily going to give us the most comprehensive look at the youth population. So moving forward, one of the areas we definitely want to be working on is working with our youth providers to get these numbers to reflect the youth, because we do see disparities in those who we are able to count. These next two slides, these are where we see the disparities coming up the most and being the most persistent and the highest. So what we're seeing here, the Black numbers at the top, those are the number of individuals who are in our shelter system in the point in time count every year. You see the blue numbers are individuals who were Black, and the reddish orange numbers are those who are not Black. So what we see is that consistently, even as the number of people in shelters fluctuates, about 60% of the folks in shelters continue to be Black. There has been a lot of targeted efforts here, and so we did see a slight reduction down to 57%, but that is still a massive overrepresentation and disparity that has to be focused on if we're going to meet our equity goals. But where we continue to see the absolute highest and most stark disparity is actually in a population that a lot of folks tend to not think or forget about, and that's folks within families. So the Black number at top are, again, folks who are experiencing homelessness as a family, and again, that is families with young children under 18, including little ones, right? And so when we look at the families in our system, that number jumps from about 60% of them being Black as high as 80% who are being Black. That is absolutely unacceptable, and we have to reduce the number of Black families in our system if we hope to meet our equity goal. So that's a lot of numbers that I've just thrown out at you all at once. So I do want to reground us in the fact that all of these numbers and all of the graphs, these are real people. When I say 400 families, that is 400 real people with little children in our system who are unable to get and keep themselves housed, right? So quick recap, for 2024 overall, areas that we saw increases were unfortunately the overall count, the disparity for Black individuals and individuals in shelters. There were a few areas where we did see a decrease, particularly in our veteran population, and then some areas were kind of flat. There wasn't a whole lot of change, that in particular being family homelessness and individuals who are experiencing chronic homelessness. So the bottom line, and what I want everyone to take away from the point in time data, is that far too many people are experiencing homelessness here in Indianapolis, and if we want to reduce this and address the inequities and disparities that we see, we're going to have to start focusing and being intentional in our work with families, but that goal is not going to be met. So as we're moving forward, there are a few things I want to keep in mind for the PIT in 2025 and beyond. First of all, we absolutely want to continue the unsheltered count processes that we had this year. It was very comprehensive and we want to keep that up. And we want to also have the opportunity to grow that comprehensive count in areas like our youth counts, because we want to make sure, as we're monitoring disparities, that everyone is being represented here. And then we're also going to be talking about what the PIT moving forward is going to do to inform our advocacy and all of our targeted efforts here in the community. And before we dive into that, I want to give a massive shout out and thank you to everyone who made this year's point in time count possible. So for those of you who are in the shelter and housing staff, you all made sure that the data was clean, you fought with the technology uploads, and you answered a flurry of emails from me to make sure that your clients were represented accurately in our uploads. And I thank you so much for that. I also want to explicitly thank the professional blended street outreach team and all of the outreach staff who went out on the night of the count. To call what you all did a count is a gross misnomer, honestly. You went out and you surveyed, but you were also connecting people to care. We had teams who went out and they found folks who were having very severe and acute mental health issues, and you got them connected to MCAT and to care. We had teams who went out and saw very serious physical health ailments, and you got them connected to our health volunteers. We had one team who found a 13-year-old who was not safe in their home and who had run away, and you got them housed that night. This is not, and you did all of this when it was rainy and muddy and cold and eerily foggy. What you did was not a count. What you did was show a shining example of what outreach could look like in our community every day if policy and resources are brought to bear to allow you to do that. So I know that not everyone who is involved in the PIC could be here today, but if you were, I just want you to know that we see you, we appreciate you, and if you are here and able, please stand so we can thank you for what you're doing every single day for these neighbors. Thank you all so much. It is truly inspiring to see what you all do. Thank you again. Thank you does not begin to cover. So now that we have talked PIT data, I want to take that PIT data and these inequities and disparities we've seen and ground it in the broader system. Because again, once we take a look at what's happening across different systems and different processes, we're going to see that none of these numbers are actually surprising. So I want to start with, why do we see homelessness in the first place? Why do people in Indianapolis leave their home, and why can't they get housed when they do? So to start, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and that is that homelessness is a systemic economic and housing issue, and that it's an issue that will be addressed by policy, or it will be sustained through policy. There are a lot of misconceptions going around about the increases the nation's seeing on homelessness. People think that it tends to be individual level factors, things like mental health issues, substance use issues, and I do not want to downplay the severity of addiction and mental illness. Those are incredibly important issues that must be addressed. They are not at the root of all of the increases that we are seeing. They are economic and housing issues, and they are affecting Indianapolis very severely. And so what we have on this screen, this is essentially a snapshot of what it's like to be housed in Indianapolis in the year 2022. So what we see consistently is that homeownership in Indianapolis is not as high as it is across the rest of the state, and it does not benefit everyone equally. Different households have lower rates of homeownership, which means two things. One, that they're not able to get the equity building from that homeownership, but also it's not as cheap to rent in Indianapolis as people would assume. If you look from 2022 back to 2015, every single year, the median rent for studio and one-bedroom apartments here in Indy was higher than the fair market rent. Essentially what that means is that what people are paying is more than what's reasonable for this area. And even broadly across the county, consistently people are struggling. Over 40% of Marion County every year is living paycheck to paycheck, unable to cover all the cost of living consistently. And when I say that, that means 40% are either living in poverty, or they're employed and they make enough money to not be considered in poverty, but they're still not able to cover their cost of living. 40% every single year here in our county. When we look specifically at renters, the majority in 2022 were earning under $50,000, and that's renting households, renting families, the majority of them under $50,000. That is a problem when it takes at least $20 an hour to be able to house yourself sustainably in Indianapolis. And we also know COVID did a doozy on renting here in Indy. From the end of 2021 to the end of 2022, the median rent here in Indianapolis went up over 30%, and that was higher than any other area in the nation. Indianapolis rent was increased more than it did in New York, Silicon Valley, Chicago. Indianapolis had the highest increases. And so ultimately what we see is that at the end of the year, 1 in 3, a third of Indianapolis was burdened by housing costs. That means a third of Indianapolis, owners and renters, were spending more than at least 30% of their income just to stay housed. That means they only had 70% to cover education, childcare, transportation, medical bills, debt, taxes, 70%, and that's a third of our county. And so ultimately what that means is that people cannot stay housed. In 2022, on average, over 1,000 households were forced to leave their home in Indianapolis because they could not afford to stay there. We had about 921 evictions and 118 foreclosures every single month. Again, that is 1,000 people in Indianapolis forced to leave their home because they couldn't afford to be there. This is an economic and housing issue. And it's an issue that is not unique to the housing system. We see disparities across the systems. If we look at the legal system, education, healthcare, these systems are full of disparities. And I want to be clear, these systems are not broken. They are working exactly as they were intended to. For the history of our country, from enslavement, segregation, redlining, policies and systems have been put in place to advance certain residents forward and hold others back. And when we see all these disparities, they feed into each other, and it really means it's no surprise when the disparities come up in our homeless population. And so I want to talk about just a few of these here in Indianapolis. So in Indianapolis with home ownership, about 60% of the county owns their home. When we look at Black households, that number is under 40%. So again, you're losing out on potential equity building, you have to struggle with all of the rent, and then we also have to look at cost of living. When we say that 40% of Indianapolis is essentially living paycheck to paycheck, if we look specifically at households that are Black, it's as high as 60%, right? So you take that economic uncertainty, you couple it with things such as the fact that about 1 in 4 mortgage applications for Black residents get denied in Indianapolis, and our systems are setting up the conditions to where Black individuals and households are more likely to experience housing instability. And these households are also going to be impacted by systems beyond housing. The legal system, for example, there are clear disparities that affect housing, and we see it across the timeline. If we look at our K-12 system in Indianapolis, Black students are more likely to receive an out-of-school suspension than other students. The counts of police use of force are higher for Black residents in Indianapolis, and we are more likely to incarcerate Black young adults in Indianapolis than we are other residents. That all has a serious impact on being able to stay housed. We also know that housing is a really critical form of healthcare, especially for folks with chronic conditions. So just 2 examples of chronic conditions and the disparities we see. If we look at new rates of HIV diagnosis and the rate of death from diabetes, it is higher for Black residents in Indianapolis on both of these accounts. That's a real double-edged sword when we think about housing. So essentially what we do is we have someone who's already experiencing economic uncertainty. You then add in the offensively high cost of medicine like insulin, and you are forcing people to choose. Do you pay your rent and have to ration your insulin and hope it works out? Or do you risk your housing stability and your ability to keep the medicine? These inequities play on each other, and they make it no surprise on the other disparities we're seeing. But I also want to be clear that there is no monolithic experience of homelessness, and there are a myriad of reasons why someone might have to leave their home. We know domestic violence is a huge issue, people get divorced, family intolerance is a huge issue, especially for queer youth in our community, and sometimes life happens. There's a home fire and your home is literally gone. None of these should be a reason someone experiences homelessness. What should happen is that regardless of why you leave your home, you are able to get quickly into a supply of accessible and affordable housing. That does not happen, and there are a couple of reasons why. First of all, there's not a lot of places to go. When you look from 2017 to 2022, the number of homes in Indianapolis that are not occupied went from 10% to 5%. So 95% of the homes in Indianapolis were occupied in 2022. Of the 5% that were vacant, only 1 in 4 was actually for sale or for rent. There's simply not enough places for people to go when they have a housing crisis. And when they do find a place to go, it's not always attainable or affordable. If Indianapolis wanted to house every renting household that made under $35,000, we would need 10,000 more units affordable at that rate. If we were to house every renting household making under $20,000, we would need 37,000 units to house everyone. There is no place to go, and there is not places to go that are affordable. And to be very clear, the policies that we have are going to sustain this. For example, Indiana does not have rent escrow policies, and we have very limited tenant protections. What that means in other states is that if your landlord is willfully neglecting the livability of your unit, you as a tenant can choose not to give them rent. You can put the rent in another office or into an account, but until they hold up their end of the bargain, they do not get paid. In Indiana, if they are not addressing the livability of your unit, you pay them either way or you get evicted. That policy and others are encouraging to out-of-state entities to come and purchase homes, especially single-family homes here in the state. And when they do that, they have no rent escrow. There are limited, if any, tenant protections, and so 2 things can happen. They can buy the home and they can refuse to fix it up, evict people, get more money from new application fees coming in, and instead of fixing up, just get paid to evict people again and again. Or they can purchase a home, typically in a lower income neighborhood, they can pour a bunch of money into it, and then charge such outrageous prices that no one can afford to live there. Neither of these is going to help keep people housed. And we also have policies that we know could work, but programs that we know could work, but the policies don't always support them. Our Housing Choice Voucher Program, for example, is one program that can help with housing stability, but it's not a protected form of payment. If a landlord sees that someone wants to pay their rent using a voucher, that alone can be a reason to deny them a lease. And then, even above housing policy, our tax policy is not friendly to those most likely to experience housing instability. A report came out just this January, showed that Indiana has the 14th most regressive tax system in the nation. What that essentially means is that our tax system is a lot more kind to those who are making a lot more money and the least likely to experience housing instability. And so I don't say all of this to suggest that it is totally hopeless. We actually have decades of evidence of what works. And again, what works is a housing-first approach that prioritizes getting people experiencing homelessness, getting them in housing, and then making sure that we well-resource the supports they need to stay housed. That research has shown that that will improve recidivism, health outcomes, safety, housing stability, of course, and ultimately costs. But we have to have a system that prioritizes that and sustains it. So the bottom line, and what I want you all to leave with, is that that is what Indianapolis needs. Regardless of why one of our residents leaves their home, they need a system and a response system that will get them access equitably to safe, affordable housing, and there has to be housing there for them to get to. So with that, I am going to transition over to Elliot to tell you about what our response system looks like and how we can get to that goal.
Good afternoon, wonderful people. Can everyone in the back hear me? Awesome. Love that. I'm Elliot Zanz. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am recently a senior project manager at CHIP. Grateful to be here with you. Thank you, Abe, for your amazing, amazing level setting. I am going to talk with you all now about our homeless response system and its goals and some of the solutions that we can see to better navigate all of the challenges we have continuing in front of us. So I'm going to talk about system goals. I'm going to talk about the universe of need of all of the community members that may or may not be interacting with our systems. We're going to visualize the continuum of care and kind of get a map of what's going on with our amazing service providers and what resources they have to offer. We're going to talk about system strategies toward our goal of racial equity, and we're going to then talk about our focus moving forward. So the goal and values of the system, which Mayor Jo Hogsett nicely briefed for us earlier, is that homelessness in Indianapolis should be rare, brief, and non-recurring. This is grounded in our belief that everyone has the right to be housed and connected to care. Housing first has to be a central system value held by all participants. And those are the goals we are rallying around. And of course, as we are seeing, the reality is that homelessness is a persistent and increasing issue we are struggling to address. So let's dig in a little bit about what rare, brief, and non-recurring could look like and what it would take to make that an actuality in our system. So in order for homelessness to be rare, to be something that does not happen frequently, we don't have 1,000 evictions a month, we need resource prevention and diversion, we need protective tenant policies, and we need a lot of affordable housing options, among many other things, but those are the highlights we're rolling with right now. To make it brief, we need a responsive housing first system, we need resourced and prioritized housing programs, and we need a big inventory of accessible units for a variety of households. In order to have homelessness be non-recurring, we have to have strong supportive services, because it's not housing only, it's housing first. You have to have those services alongside if we want people to succeed. You need access to your healthcare, you need transportation, you need education and employment opportunities and livable wages within those employment opportunities. We need permanent housing options, and we need folks, as I said, to be connected to care. I want to acknowledge that not all of these are directly within the control of our homeless response system. It takes the whole community to make some of these bigger changes, and when we coordinate, when we coordinate with a deep understanding of our community needs, we can make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring for more neighbors. We have the power to create a community that prioritizes the well-being of its members and moves towards systemic compassion rather than systemic oppression or systemic violence. So let's talk about the universe of need, and Abe already went over some of this, so it might feel a little redundant, but I want to talk about not only people experiencing literal homelessness, but those in the unstable homelessness positions and folks who are already in system-supported housing that our resources are already going to support, but that funding is sometimes precarious and can be interrupted. So there's a lot here. It can feel overwhelming, and it kind of should, because this is representing so much of our population that is living paycheck to paycheck, had to borrow to avoid eviction, is experiencing foster care, or is coming from unsafe or unstable family situations at any age. Folks who are couch surfing and doubled up, folks experiencing domestic violence and survival sex, folks in the hospital or incarceration who have nowhere to go when they are discharged, our folks, of course, living on the street or in a car or in an abandoned building. Student homelessness shows up very differently as well and is sometimes kind of seasonal, so you especially might not see student homelessness captured on the point in time count. Anything in red here is something that is likely to show up on the point in time count, with kind of a caveat, like not all folks experiencing domestic violence are going to be represented on point in time, but those in these situations will. And the same with recovery housing, which is sometimes counted as transitional housing and sometimes isn't, depending on HUD and funding. So this is just kind of one snapshot. This also includes folks in temporary hotel stays because maybe their house did catch on fire, folks who are overcrowded, living paycheck to paycheck, as I said, and folks experiencing human trafficking. So this is not an exhaustive list of every circumstance, obviously, but it does provide that bigger picture we need to keep in mind of the challenges faced by ourselves and our neighbors. And again, to clarify, those experiencing homelessness from all of these and economic and societal strain are no different from you and I. And we really need to internalize that as we move this work forward with compassion. So let's talk. Here is a system map of what our system looks like, a simple system map to address homelessness in Indianapolis. Often this is referred to as the Indianapolis Continuum of Care, or the COC. That describes the network of homeless service providers within a geographic area. Ours serves Marion County, as has been said. These are the basic activities that every Continuum of Care that receives HUD or the Department of Housing and Urban Development federal funding generally has. So there's prevention and diversion. Raise your hand if you're prevention and diversion in the house. Hey, hi, thank you for coming. Thank you for your work. So important. So diversion is targeted to those who have already lost their own housing, are doubled up, and are running out of places to stay. They are on the doorstep of our housing system. Prevention is targeted to individuals and families who currently have housing but are at risk of homelessness due to eviction, family conflict. The house becoming uninhabitable might apply here, and we absolutely need them to prevent all of this inflow into our system of more and more people experiencing homelessness. Street outreach, as we got an awesome overview of all the cool work they can and did do for especially the point in time count. Street outreach in the house, raise your hands. Thank you. Obviously reaches out to our unsheltered neighbors and helps them connect to care, find housing, have their basic needs met as they are going through those experiences. We always have emergency shelter and transitional housing, which gives folks a safe place to stay, hopefully, while they are in crisis. And that is the system that is serving a lot of our families and a lot of our Black families especially. That's where we're seeing them. Emergency shelter in the house. Thank you. I'm so glad to see everybody here. This is great. Just constant shout outs to this incredible section of our community who is represented here. We have supportive services, and these are embedded and across all of the different agencies and providers and beyond. So that's your employment services, your education folks, your folks helping with transportation, healthcare, pretty much anything you can think of that isn't the literal housing piece. That is supportive services, and it is critical for everyone's well-being. Who's our supportive service providers? Housing providers can count. Thank you. And then last but absolutely not least, our and not actually last because I have to talk about the coordinated entry system, but that's a process, not a program. So rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing are two of our most robust housing options. Rapid rehousing provides rental assistance and case management assistance for folks experiencing homelessness for up to 2 years or at risk of experiencing homelessness depending on their situation. And permanent supportive housing is for our neighbors who have experienced homelessness at a chronic level for a year or more and also have a disabling condition defined by HUD. And those programs and the support given within them stabilizes such a big part of our community. Who's our housing people? Thank you for what you're doing. Yes, thank you so much. So that's kind of a snapshot of the activities and the folks doing this amazing work. We also have our coordinated entry system, which we're going to talk a lot about, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. The coordinated entry system is a HUD-mandated process all continuums of care must implement to try and connect the most vulnerable members of our communities to our very limited, as stated, housing resources. This involves an assessment process, usually an interview of the person who is seeking housing by a skilled assessor, and then a prioritization for our limited housing options based on a community-driven understanding of vulnerability and need. And that is a really hard thing to determine. Everybody needs housing. Everybody deserves housing. And so coordinated entry is a hard job, and it's an important job to try and keep the folks who need housing to stay alive, maybe more direly, as much as possible, housed. And so shout out to our coordinated entry system admins and folks who have worked in this process as assessors. Raise your hands. You are also a critical part of our system. And we appreciate the hard and heartbreaking work we do to help folks access housing when we need to just house everybody, and we know we can't. But let's work toward that. So ideally, the system response to homelessness would be, no matter where you come in, you end up with stable housing. If we were fully resourced and our policy climate was different, and we had a reimagining of community, which I believe all these things are possible, but they will require us to make some really big decisions and changes. Ideally, you're at risk of losing your housing, prevention catches you. You're out of housing and need one more place to go, diversion catches you. You end up actually on the street and are missed by those things, but street outreach catches you and directs you to supportive and stable housing. You hit emergency shelter or transitional housing, and that helps you still access stable housing. You go through housing programs or voucher programs, and you get stable, safe, affordable housing. And that is the vision that we need to hold close to our hearts, because I think we can get way closer than we are, and I think we can absolutely eliminate the racial disparities that we have been persisting in holding us through all of these systems. So let's talk about the realities of the system response to homelessness. As we've said, with limited resources and increasing need, we cannot currently address homelessness in the fast and responsive way that we desire. The people we can help the fastest are those who we can divert from entering the system entirely, because then they avoid getting stuck. Folks who enter the system, especially families, end up waiting for a really long time before being able to access housing. It's very hard, and we'll go more into why that is soon. Housing options, as we've said repeatedly, are limited, and there are very few units available that are also suitable for families. A lot of our units that have come in are 0 and 1 bedrooms, and that is not sufficient for families. And when we're seeing the racial disparity hit families, Black families the hardest, that is a problem that we need to resolve. So currently we're managing homelessness in Indianapolis, but not moving toward ending it. And this is on par with the national struggle, but I believe we can do better. So, key takeaways from our system overview. The goal is for homelessness to be rare, brief, and non-recurring. Resources are limited and need is high. We're managing homelessness, not ending it, and we must prioritize diversion and permanent housing for families, especially if we want to move forward this racial equity goal to reduce Black homelessness. I don't want that to make us feel overly defeated, so we have also in this, even in spite of all of this struggle, have had massive system housing successes. In 2023, over 960 neighbors moved into either permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing. Shout out to all the people in this room who made that happen. Over 900 neighbors left emergency shelters, transitional housing, or prevention programs into permanent housing. Good job. The heart is here, the work is here, and I think we can work together to push for the kinds of policies and changes we need to see to keep doing this work and make a difference in the equity situation. So we're going to talk now about system strategies for racial equity. We're going to review our original tactics, and we're going to look at the current data. So we're looking to reduce Black homelessness in Indianapolis by 35% by 2025. Our original tactics to meet our equity goal were to create an equitable coordinated entry process, implement a centralized housing navigation team, and strengthen supportive services, specifically housing case management. We first focused on creating an equitable coordinated entry process because this assessment we were using was found to be inequitable, and that could not continue. And following coordinated entry system refinement, the process is becoming more equitable. So you can see here, this data reflects interim prioritization that was in place from January 1st of this year through May 14th of this year, 2024. You can see that coordinated entry assessments, so the interviews being done with folks experiencing homelessness, included 57% of Black neighbors. Referrals to permanent housing went 64% to Black neighbors, and permanent housing placements went 61% to Black neighbors, which is fantastic. This shows an increase in prioritization of Black households from Q1 of 2023, where it went from 53% to 57% for assessments, 51% to 64% for referrals to permanent housing, which is fantastic, and 55 to 61% of permanent housing placements. So we did increase it's becoming more equitable, and we had increases across the board already in the first 5 months of this year, which is so great. So since this was one of the primary goals, was to redesign coordinated entry, and there have been these really great strides, why don't we see that when we're looking at our takeaways here, where there is an increase in the total count and increase in Black homelessness. And there was little to no change in family homelessness, which we have already established is one of the big issues. So the issue is inflow. So what this slide tells us is that it shows where people are entering our system for the first time, broken out by race. We can see that most of the people experiencing homelessness for the first time are Black, and they're showing up across the system, but especially in family emergency shelters. Family emergency shelters play a critical role in keeping families together and helping them connect to services and housing options. While we're adding more housing units and coordinated entry is more equitable, those units, as I said previously, 0 and 1 bedroom, are not accessible to families. And so in order to move this specific population into more housing, we have to be focusing on upstream solutions to prevent them entering the system, and also increasing housing options so they have somewhere to go once they get here. Because there's only so much work our amazing service providers can do when there are just no units available. And we have to grapple with that reality. So let's talk also about family shelter bed loss. The number of family beds in shelters from 2020 to 24 is shown on this slide, and you can see that it is decreasing, and we are also, I think that's a little repetitive, but yeah, we're seeing a decrease in family beds within shelters. And with a disproportionate number of Black families showing up in shelter, losing family shelter beds is another big issue for our racial equity and for Black family homelessness access to resources. So what system housing options are families accessing? And this shows referrals since the 2023 PIT, and you can see that the highest access number is for homeless preference vouchers at 52% for families, and this is just all families. Rapid rehousing, folks is serving 43% families, other permanent housing 35, and then So I do want to call out permanent supportive housing for families is really minimal. It's only 14%, which is its own issue. And then vouchers are going to be a key family housing resource. So we did recently add critical permanent supportive housing units, PSH units, which is fantastic. Shout out to everyone who's been working on that. Because while it might be easy to be like, we added units, the work that went into adding units is massive and immense and painstaking, and just deep and unending gratitude for everyone who has helped more of our neighbors move into those units and make them habitable and good places to be. So that's really exciting. We have had projects coming online. We are having some more PSH projects coming online, and that is exciting and good. And also, due to some losses we've had, inventory becomes steady but isn't actually increasing. So we've lost a few permanent supportive housing projects, and that unfortunately included some different family projects. So while overall we're kind of holding steady, and we would be really in a bad place if we were not continuing to bring more projects online, this permanent housing loss is, of course, again, disproportionately affecting families. So there's a lot of compounding issues. And here's where we can see permanent family housing unit inventory dipping down from 2022 to 2024 for permanent supportive and rapid rehousing units. So the bottom line from this whole section is that our response system is becoming more equitable, which is amazing, and a lot of people have put a lot of work into making that happen, so shout out to Coordinated Entry System Refinement. If we truly want to reduce Black homelessness, we must both minimize people coming into the system and increase permanent housing options, especially for families. And here are our key takeaways. So the work moving forward is we're going to need some more family shelter capacity and housing navigation focus for our stretch family emergency shelters where we are seeing the most people show up. We really need diversion to address this big inflow that we're experiencing. We have to, again, be focused on housing families and family-friendly housing units that they can actually fit into, and also looking into more permanent supportive housing for families as we've lost some of that inventory. HIT 2025, again, we want to continue our comprehensive unsheltered count. We want to improve youth and young adult counts because we have to have a vision of everyone in our system and make sure they are seen and we can respond to that need. And we will continue to monitor our racial equity goal and see how we do. And now I'm going to hand it over to Chelsea to give us our call to action. Thank you all for your time, attention, and amazing hard work.
Okay, I know that was a lot. So thank you all for taking it in, for digesting. Again, if you're like me, there's a lot to process here, so we will make sure that you have access to all of this information and data. It will be public on our website so you can dive in, and we hope this is just the beginning of a conversation. So connect with us, reach out as you want to dig in more to this. What we want to leave here today with is a call to action. We all have specific levers that we can pull in the places that we sit, in the places and spheres of influence that we have, and we want to really kind of leave you with what can I do? What can I do in leaving this room to be part of the collective effort to make a greater impact here? Because it is solvable here. I don't want you to leave this room thinking, wow, we're not seeing the gains that we should be. We're not, but it's not because we can't. Homelessness is solvable in Indianapolis. I firmly believe that. But it's going to take all of us using what we have to push in some of the bigger areas. So what does the system need? And I know Elliot touched on a lot of this, but we need continued investment in supportive and affordable housing. This isn't something you do one and done. It is continuous. We have to really make sure that we are aligning investments around more supply and more access to what's out there in the market. It's a both and. We need to be strategic and aligned in what we invest in and look at what's working. Let's look at the performance. What are the interventions that are working to house folks and to keep folks housed? And let's make sure that those can be scaled. And that's hard sometimes because it's easy to chase the shiny new things. But at the end of the day, we actually know what works. We have data that shows what works, but we just haven't invested in a way that scales it to meet the need. We need a functioning and responsive public housing agency that continues to prioritize homelessness. And I know there's a lot of work happening to make that a reality, but vouchers, as you saw, are critical. They are a critical resource, and they are most critical for families. And so we're really eager to get IHA back to a place that we can continue this work together. That means we need more special purpose vouchers that can be allocated to homelessness. We've tapped into some of them. Housing choice vouchers, foster youth to independence vouchers. These are phenomenal. We need more. And that's all the way from HUD down. We need state policy to be our friend, and right now it's not. We need state policy that prevents income discrimination, particularly in terms of the accepting of housing vouchers. That should be a form of income that cannot be denied. We need better tenant protections, and we need the state to incentivize investment in more housing development. The city has done a tremendous amount of work in this, but the city only has so many tools in its toolbox. We need the state at the table as well. And we need champions more than ever to protect and advocate for housing first as an evidence-based solution. And I'm gonna tell you right now, this is critical. Within the next 2 or 3 days, we're gonna learn about the Johnson v. Grants Pass decision at the Supreme Court and whether or not cities have the authority to criminalize sleeping outside and experiencing homelessness. And regardless of the Supreme Court decision, we have to make a decision here in Indianapolis of what's right, no matter what the Supreme Court says. It is not okay to penalize or criminalize people for experiencing homelessness. And we need everyone, not only in the city, but in the state, to recognize that reality, that solves nothing, and that we actually know what will solve it, and it is housing first, and we need champions that can show up at the State House and make that known. And I will give you another just tidbit. There is a group called the Cicero Institute. It's out of Texas. They write model legislation for states that are working to criminalize homelessness. Cicero popped up in Indiana last year. Thankfully, there was a quick response, and we got the bill pulled before it even got heard in committee, but it is coming back. Cicero has hired an Indiana lobbyist, and we expect to see it pop up again this session. And we need people ready to rally and show up at the State House and make sure that that does not happen in Indiana. Because we know, again, what works. Policies that work are policies that prioritize eviction prevention, keeping people in their house. Universal rental assistance, which is primarily in the form of housing vouchers. Policies that help match wages to costs, housing costs, and we know we have huge wage disparity here in Indiana. Policies that focus on repairing and preserving affordable housing. I mean, the list is long here. We know the things that work, but we need more advocates to show up and demand that these things be implemented and protected here in Indiana. Because what doesn't work is fining and criminalizing folks. Disinvesting in housing, focusing only on crisis response and not investment in housing, because there's got to be a pathway to somewhere. What doesn't work, and I know the folks in Indy feel this strongly, is preempting local efforts to try to do this stuff. And we know Indianapolis has tried to do lots of things to advance these policies, only to be preempted at the State House. And so what all of this is saying is that we need more advocates really talking about and advancing policies and ready to go to battle when terrible policies pop up. So this requires us all to understand our role in helping to elevate political and social will to do the right things. and to advance the things that we know are going to solve homelessness. James Baldwin said that, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And it's time to face the realities. We know what works. We have to rally. We have to be a unified voice in making sure that we're advancing these solutions, and we have to be ready to show up and make sure that our policymakers hear us and keep this at the top of the political agenda. Homelessness has to be a priority, and we have to have the political will to find all of the tools in the toolbox to make a greater impact. And again, that requires more than just those in the homeless response system. That requires everyone in this room to figure out in your spheres of influence where you can start pushing these conversations. So engage with people that maybe need to be a little more educated on the issues and the solutions. Show up and talk to your elected officials at the local level, at the state level. Continue this learning journey about what we know, what we're doing, and what we need to really make a bigger impact. Here's a couple ways that can look. The Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition is a statewide organization that is really pushing state policy to do some of the things we talked about. Rent escrow, tenant protections. Get involved with them. Get on their list so you know what's happening at the State House. The National Alliance to End Homelessness does this at the federal level. Again, another organization you can follow so that you know what's happening at Congress and you can start writing your representatives. Participate in the pig count next year. Get more proximate to the issue. We look for tons of volunteers. I think we had almost 100 volunteers this last pit. If you've never done it, please reach out to us. We'd love to engage you. Work with an organization. There are so many organizations out here doing the good work that need volunteers, that want folks to come and learn more about the work that they're doing. That can look a lot of ways: volunteering, serving on a board. And I think most importantly, use your voice. Use your voice with elected officials, with your networks. And as we've talked about today, every data piece, everything we've talked about represents a real human life that is out there on our streets struggling. And I know folks in this room see people every day. If you leave with nothing else today, I would say leave with a sense of recognizing and seeing that person in our community that at the very least needs a human kindness, some compassion, and somebody to say, I see you. And I know we can do better as a community because you don't deserve to be out here. So don't shy away. Face the reality and ask yourself, what can I do? Where's my influence that I can help advance this work and make sure that we have and can make a bigger impact? Continue to ask you to come on a learning journey with us. Lots of ways to continue that. Again, we'll share all of this out. But I think that education becomes really critical. And then one last thing, because I know we've kept you 2 minutes over. This is just the beginning of some continued conversations and events to really make sure that we fully understand the drivers of homelessness, the solutions, and what we really should be advocating and rallying around. So there is another event coming up here in just a few months that I would invite you and encourage you all to be part of. There is a new film that's just been released called Beyond the Bridge, A Solution to Homelessness. It's actually a follow-up film to Under the Bridge, which featured Indianapolis almost 10 years ago, when Indianapolis took more of a stance of criminalizing homelessness. And after that film was released and ruffled lots and lots of feathers, and actually became a catalyst to the Homeless Bill of Rights that Indianapolis passed, one of the first in the country, the filmmaker said, okay, we talked about the problems, but what are the actual solutions? Let's look at the places across this country that are making a huge impact. And that is the catalyst to the second film. And it looks at the impact of housing first in communities all over this country, including right up the road in Milwaukee, where we've seen significant reductions in homelessness. We're going to be doing a film premiere here in Indianapolis on August 20th. It will be a free event. We invite everybody here to come back and have this continued conversation because we need everybody. We need you all at the table and joining us in this effort to make homelessness in Indianapolis rare, brief, and non-reoccurring, doing it in a way that is grounded in housing first and driven by a commitment to equity. So thank you all for taking time out of your days to sit with us, to be with us, for your advocacy and your support. I want to give a special shout out to the PIT team leaders of this last 2024 point in time count, Sarah Nolan, Nikki Watson, Abe Roll. Phenomenal job. Thank you for all of your hard work. And a huge shout out for the CHIP team and Abe, a special kudos for really putting the vision behind and the work behind the State of Homelessness address. We hope to do this with you every year and to be able next year to talk about the significant progress that has made and to be able to say, guess what? We met our equity goal and we eliminated racial disparities in homelessness. I'd love to stand up here next year and be able to say that with all of you. So thank you for your support, thank you for being here, and for what you do every day as advocates in this city. Thank you.